Apparently I have to stay behind the podium today, so I apologise if I don't pace. The reason I have to stay behind the podium is that we're recording for YouTube. That means that all your questions will also be recorded, but the audio may not be very good. So when you ask a question, I'll repeat the question so that everyone can hear it as well. Principles of adult education means that you come to this session with a lot of knowledge and skills and attitudes and behaviours already, and the best way to engage in getting from wherever you are, perhaps to knowing more than you did when you came in, is to ask questions when they come up. So please feel free to ask questions at any time and don't save them up for the end. I apologise to maternal and child health nurses who have heard a little bit of this before. So I want to start talking about autism, and the way I'm going to start talking about it is talking about something that our hospital is very practically doing to try and improve access for patients who have serious disabilities. And in my head, when I think about the kinds of disabilities which make for the most difficult access, it's actually not about people with mobility problems, although that's an issue. It's actually about people who have such overwhelming anxiety or intellectual disability or autism to the point where it's difficult to get through the door. We know it's a problem, and we know that some people suffer from adverse health consequences because they can't get to us. And so the Department of Health gave us some money, and Caitlin Wright, who's in the audience tonight, has been leading the project. Caitlin, by discipline, is a speech therapist, but is much more broad than that and has done an excellent job. And so what we've been trying to do is improve access to hospital. One way is through gearing up our staff, which is, with an organisation, I'd say leaky, with people coming through all the time, is going to be a constant thing we have to work on, to be changing the culture of our workforce such that they are more comfortable with and more able to deal with people with severe disabilities. We're developing individual plans for them, and they are done in negotiation with the patient and the carer, and for some GPs they've been quite heavily involved in this as well. So that, and there's two bits to that. There's a bit which is present on the alerts in emergency, which will tell if there's an unexpected requirement for admission, will tell the emergency staff really the key things they need to know. So this patient will likely be very agitated and nervous, that using the obvious things like a quiet environment and low stimulation and all that sort of stuff, but also some simple guidelines as to what medications will help early. So we're doing that, and part of it is about coming in, which I will call admission, stay and discharge. And we're trying to improve, make a single point of access for GPs to phone into us to let us know somebody's coming, so that we do a better job in streamlining this process for these citizens of ours. We've also been asked by the Department of Health to help look at how we can improve care in the community. You guys do that better than us. We're trying, and we're trying to add to it as best we can, and we've gone and looked at a number of different sort of clinical care pathways and things, so that we don't forget that they don't get outside and they've got low vitamin D, and by the way, they probably haven't had their teeth checked for 8 years and stuff like that. So the normal pro formas that you would use, and we've looked at quite a few of them, and we've come to some conclusions which we're putting into the health pathways. And we've been contributing to 2 of your health pathways, one in the health assessment of people with disabilities, but also a pathway on challenging behaviours. And the practical guidelines I've talked about. So, I usually pick my videos very carefully. I'm only going to show you about 50 seconds of this video, which is an experience of a parent and accessing a GP. And no, I'm going to dump it because the audio's not adequate. I tested it on you, the video worked. But essentially, it's something that we're hoping to roll out in different places, including GP organisation, education sessions. but we will do so with audio and all that sort of stuff and show you the package we're presenting. But that video mostly speaks to the experience of waiting in a waiting room in a general practice when you have severe autism, and some practical strategies that has come from your group, not our group, in making that better, such as waiting in the car and being phoned by mobile when it's time to come in and stuff like that. All right, let's move on to the meat of the session. And the first part is autism. Autism has been around for a very long time, and I could give you a history of it from Kanner, who first described those people who sit in the corner and self-stimulate and rock and never speak. And Kanner's type autism still exists, and I've got a few patients who have that type, but we now recognise it as clearly a spectrum. And on the milder ends of the spectrum, I think there are certainly still aspects of disability to this type of personality, but I think there are also aspects of gift. And when I'm talking to families, I keep reinforcing that because some of the most interesting and amazing people who have made deep contributions to our world have had this type of personality. One of the great gifts is the ability, frankly, not to care what anybody else thinks, and to follow your own interests with a depth of passion that I certainly couldn't match, although my wife thinks I'm autistic, but moving on. And to come up with genuinely original ideas. And so Albert Einstein didn't speak until the age of 4 and developed a concept between energy and mass which was groundbreaking, and he was almost certainly autistic. Mozart, again famous for his social inabilities, but an amazing ability from a very young age to focus on and produce beautiful music. Bill Gates, probably autistic. I don't believe he's ever been diagnosed, but Tim Fisher, and it's in the public record that his son is certainly autistic. And lots and lots of people have contributed greatly to our society. It's not always a disability. I deliberately put up a whole heap of text to scare you, and it scares me because it's 1/3 of the DSM requirements, and I'm just going to work through them a bit, and don't worry, I'll go through the important bits. The first is that under DSM-5, a patient or a person must have deficits in social communication and social interaction, and it can't only be in one context. Now that used to be clearly language, that you had to have an impairment in language, and it usually still is language based, but we understand, spoken language based, but we understand now that communication is so much more broad than that. But without a deficit in social communication, you can't have autism. And I'll talk more about what practically that looks like for our patients. You must have restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviour. Now that can be rocking, but it can be many other things, such as echolalia speech, heaps of things which I'll go through in a minute. But this is the second major pillar on which autism must be judged. So you must have deficits of social communication, you must have repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities, and as the DSM always said, and they must be present early. So if these come on at age 12, 15 or 20, you have a problem, but the problem is not autism, and we as clinicians have a responsibility to look further as to why this person is like this. So and the old DSM, DSM-4 text revised, said 3 years of age. It's now a little bit more flexible, but it must be in early developmental life. And the pressures on us as clinicians working with children to diagnose these kids earlier and earlier, and if I forget, I need to talk to you about that because there's some pluses and minuses to it. And as DSM says, if you don't have significant impairment in social, occupational or other important areas, then it is not a disease or a condition. I think that's very important as well. That's one of the conversations I have in the first consultation when this arises. I ask the question, does your child have a problem that requires a solution? Because if not, let's just forget this and move on. You have to have a problem that requires a solution or requires help. And also, as DSM likes to do, it always likes to hedge its bets, and it can't be related to, it can't be better explained by a disability or global developmental delay. Now, the problem with that is that often people with autism, not everyone, because there are Bill Gates and Albert Einstein and things with very high IQs, but there's an association with people who have suboptimal IQ. So what it says is that the social communication must be below that which you would expect given their other levels of deficit. Okay, now let's talk about and the last thing to say is that we used to have Asperger's syndrome, which no longer exists. We used to have pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which nobody could ever remember. And autistic disorder, and now it's all under autism spectrum disorder. It's one diagnosis. And so if you've had letters from us 3 years ago or 5 years ago which said that the patient had Asperger's syndrome, we haven't re-diagnosed them. It's just that the DSM has changed and asked us to classify it that way. I present this slide mostly to talk about theory of mind, because it's probably the most important deficit. And the slide, just to take you through it so you can get over it, is that the whole point of theory of mind is the idea that I can get some idea of what you're thinking and realise that we're not necessarily thinking the same thing. It's natural to teachers, and actually it's natural to good GPs as well, and nurses and speechies and all that, because what we do is we find ourselves constantly adjusting what we're doing and what we're saying in response to feedback from the people we're dealing with. And so in this room at the moment, I know that some people are very interested and frowning and I'm wondering how that applies to me. Other people are thinking, I didn't get that curry. Some people are thinking, I really, really, really wish I was home with my children. And without deliberately doing so, what little theory of mind I have causes me to adjust my delivery and that's not an autistic thing. An autistic lecturer, you will remember if you went to university, because they simply had one way of delivering it and they didn't care, and they will often have read, and the content will have been amazing but desperately inaccessible to the rest of us because they didn't adjust their delivery. They write better than they speak. But theory of mind, so this is Sally and this is Anne. Sally has a basket and Anne has a box. Sally has a marble and she puts her marble in the basket and then she walks out. And then Anne takes the marble out of the basket and puts it in the box. Now Sally comes back and she wants to play with her marble. Where will she look? So this is just one simple test of theory of mind, and there are many, many, and I don't say this is a very good one, but what it will actually differentiate somewhat, because I think most of us in the audience will not be autistic, and we will know that in fact it's in the box. We'll know it in the box, but we'll know that Sally's expecting it to be in the basket. But if you have deficit theory of mind, you have a perception that the other person is thinking exactly as you are. And therefore, the answer will be, well, of course you'll think it's in the box because that's what I think. And it takes it out nicely. Now, that's a test, and it's not the only test, and I don't even know if it's a good test. But we see this in daily life with people with autism all the time. And the way that's often driven home to me is that when they're interested in something, they will talk about it and talk about it and talk about it until I, as a clinician who try really hard to be interested, am just bored to tears by a discussion of dinosaurs or Thomas the Tank Engine or steam engines or whatever else. Because, but they lack theory of mind, and they will lack the ability to recognise that I'm getting bored because it's interesting in their mind. They lack theory of mind, therefore they assume that it must be fascinating to you too. In the same way, theory of mind and the failure to recognise that other people's experiences and feelings are fundamentally deeply different to your own means that sometimes they'll say deeply offensive things because they don't think of them as offensive, they're simply making an observation. For example, This is normal for kids. Children will sometimes comment on the size of my tummy, which is fine, or the size of my nose. Now that's fine for a 4-year-old, but when a 15-year-old comments like that, it says something. It says that they lack theory of mind, they lack social grace. It's funny, but actually it ends up causing them to be, over time, very socially isolated because they just offend so many people across time. And it's a lack of theory of mind, and it's fundamental to a diagnosis of autism. Theory of mind. I'll talk a little bit about sensory differences, which are profound. Poor quality peer relationships we need to talk about, and communication differences, which I've already mentioned, but we'll go into in some depth. Yes?
Can I just ask, are you going to talk a bit about what to do to try and help them get some sort of theory of mind?
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't going to, but thank you for asking. So there is some published evidence on this, and we mostly rely on high-quality teachers, high-quality speeches, high-quality OTs, and high-quality psychologists who are well trained in this, because it's actually mostly about presenting. And I should, for the purpose of our recording, say that the question was, are we going to talk about how to help people develop theory of mind? So with high quality interventions in small groups, often in social groups, we go through a system called social stories. Has anybody heard of social stories? So social stories really use cartoons because it's a mode that is familiar to young people and children from a young age, and it tells stories to help them enter into the mind of the other person in the experience. So one social story might be, and they're often very deliberately selected for the problem that is at hand. So one problem might be that a child who really wants to make friends is coming up and he doesn't know how to say hello to people. And so the way he's saying hello to people is to come up and hit them in the arm. Now, there'll be a social story for that, because there's thousands of social stories. And the social story will be a short sort of vignette of a child who is coming up to another child and hitting them in the arm, and then the other child is hurt and feels sad and so on. And it is a bit like water against rock. I often describe it like people learn playing football. Some people are just naturals at it, and they can pick up a football and kick with both feet, but most of us aren't like that. In social situations, most of us are actually like the people who can pick up a football and kick with both feet, but some people need to learn this skill. And some people need to learn this skill through deliberate, methodical, repetitive drills. And social stories are a way of simply going through a social vignette and giving them the insight as to what the other person experiences and feels. And it will never be a strength. They will never come to normal, but one of the principles of helping people with autism is to identify their deficits and try and get them to good enough, or as close to good enough as we can get them. There are other ways to do so as well, but that's the key way that we know to help theory of mind. We can do it in our daily lives as well. So one of the things I do when I have the trust and respect of families is when a kid starts, and that wouldn't be on the first visit, it might be on the 5th, but when a child starts to talk to me about steam engines again, and they've been going for about 5 minutes, and they know I like them, I say, stop for a minute, what's my face looking like? And they'll say, I don't know, and look carefully. I'm really bored. You're talking about steam engines, and I'm interested in steam engines, but you've talked about steam engines for so long that it's starting to make me feel a little bit bored because I'm interested in other things as well. That's all. So it's like a little micro intervention, and then you move on to other things, but you just want to sort of give them the idea, what's my face doing? Because we will normally recognise facial expressions. But if you have autism spectrum disorder, that won't always necessarily come. And one of the things when you're taking history is, does your child recognise when you're angry or sad? And often the report will come back, yes, but only when I'm really, really angry or really, really sad, and the subtleties and nuance of facial expression are completely lost on them. That's two ways, and there are plenty of others. But using and engaging regular people who do this for a living, and there are those in our community, I think is one of the most important ways, and teachers have a real role, and they're trying hard. Many schools and education systems are trying hard to get better at this stuff. Okay, so sensory differences. If there was a sort of a generality to sensory differences that exist for people with autism, it would be that they tend to be hypersensitive. So little things can really bother them. And that can be things like unexpected touch, particularly light touch. Funnily, light touch. Deep touch is fine. Deep cuddles are fine. But light touch, it's too much. It's like a tickle as opposed to a touch. It's overwhelming for them. Certain kind of clothing is common, so I have some patients who just will not wear socks, and I find myself writing letters to school saying, please excuse Johnny because he's just not going to wear socks, and if you insist on him wearing socks, he's just not going to get to school, so can we please just split the difference and accept that he won't wear socks. Now, that's actually a problem because it's a bit like parenting. Parenting a child with autism is different because treating kids differently within a family can generate some discomfort for the other kids. And schools have a difficult road in providing what is expected for all others whilst allowing exceptions for these kids. But the fact is, if you insist on socks, you've got a problem. Some parents just go out of their way, get special socks made with no seams, because it's often that little line at the toes, you know, that line where that's the thing. It's just, I can't stand that. Many families have no idea their children have autism, but are just such lovely, natural, instinctive parents. They've actually done 3/4 of what we would have suggested anyway. So these are the families where, yeah, of course he doesn't like labels on his clothes. As soon as we buy the clothes, the first thing we do is cut the labels off, because he'd never wear clothes with labels, because labels are scratchy and they bother them. Wool against skin. Lots of people don't wear wool anymore, so this is less of an issue than it used to be, but that scratchiness is a real issue. I have one patient who simply can't stand the feel of anything against his legs, and he has to go to school in shorts. All day, every day, 365 days a year, well, the 200 days that school's in, he has to go to school in shorts because he just can't bear. I've got another patient who takes 90 minutes to get her shoes on in the morning, because it takes her that long to just deal with the feeling of the shoe. Once they're on, they're fine, but please don't ask her to take her shoes off at school, because we will have the same problem. It'll take 90 minutes to get the shoes back on. It's just that feeling is so hard for them. Many kids don't like stickiness or mud on their fingers, so they will play, but they don't like the stickiness and it needs to come off quickly. Whereas water, some of these kids are just obsessed by all the different characteristics of water. And if you see them at kindergarten, they will just sit in that trough and just play, and they'll be interested in the ripples, and they'll be interested in the feel, and they'll be interested in the surface tension that drops on the sides, and water will fascinate them. And another big one, and it's a problem in, I think, I'm not an educator, but I spend a lot of time in schools and in classrooms, and they are different to what you experienced when you were a kid. So certainly when I was a kid, it was chalk and talk, teacher up the front, rows of desks. I sometimes walk into a class, I don't know where the front of the room is, because it's all zoned learning, teacher going from zone to zone, setting kids up with an activity, getting them started, moving on to the next one, keeping an eye on everyone. Team teaching, so there's often a class, perhaps of 45 or 50 with 2 teachers in the room doing the same thing. And now, the other thing that's changed is that there has been a substantial investment by the Department of Education to get teachers' aides into school. And some of they do all sorts of things, but one of the things they do is keep kids that are wandering off on task because the teacher's not there to throw chalk at them, like I had when I was a student. Now, that's wonderful, and actually there's lots of good research evidence to say that that's a great way to engage kids, get them imagining and learning better, unless you have autism and ADD. Because they're louder classrooms, they're more relaxed classrooms, they're less strict, and that stimulation, the stimulation of everything up on the walls, which is great for the other 95% of kids, the stimulation of children next to them that can touch them and touch their stuff, and the noise is very distracting and heightening of anxiety. And so there's more than a few kids in our community who wear earmuffs at school, so big earmuffs. We've tried the iPods with playing white noise and stuff, but the other kids want to use them as well. So now earmuffs seem to be more acceptable to many schools. And by reducing that sensation, and the other one which is very interesting is coming into school. That's often really loud because all the kids are so happy to see each other. They arrive at 8:30, the bell rings at 5 to 9, there's a lot of activity, there's lots of chasey, everyone's climbing on the monkey bars, and actually transitioning from the car through the front gate to the classroom is sometimes overwhelming. So there are some kids where we use the earmuffs as they walk into school, and once they're settled and relaxed at the desk, they can take them off. Now, it sounds like we're pandering to them, but actually it's allowing them to access the curriculum. It's allowing them to get there because some kids just wouldn't have got there before. And once they're there, it's allowing them to learn. Language. So some kids will never have good, useful spoken language. And in the olden days, when we were very, very narrow in the way we defined and diagnosed autism spectrum disorder, 1/3 of kids would never have had, I would say, useful spoken language. So they might have had a few words, but it was nowhere near enough to have, to even express their needs fully. Now, because we define it more widely now, that's a smaller group which is still there, but many of those, the other pathways around, so for some of them cued speech, for some signing, and for some using pictorial cards, and there's different systems of picture communication strategies that can be used. And visual is always far easier to use as a communication medium than verbal, pretty much for every kid with autism. And I think of lots of different ways that this is useful for me to know. One way is that getting these kids to sequence the things that they need to do to get ready for school. Now, I've talked about ADD before, and some of you might have been here for that, and I talked about asking Johnny to go to his room, get his shoes and get in the car, and Johnny would get as far as his room and would mean well, but would get distracted by the Lego. Yep. So that's ADD. These kids, just verbal stuff just doesn't go in very well. And so one of the strategies we use to help these kids to get ready for school is to keep language short and use pictorial representation. So you have a picture of the shower, and you have a picture of clothes, and you have a picture of a bowl of cereal, and you have a picture of whatever you need to do, and instead of telling them what to do, which is relatively ineffective, you bring them to the pictorial board and you say, where are you? Where do you need to be next? Bang. It's a better way to do it. One of the people, there are many people who have helped me understand autism better than I did a few years ago, and one of them is a psychologist down in Melbourne called Richard Eisenmeyer, and I remember him talking about a patient he had one of his niches is helping professionals who are highly skilled in their profession but deeply autistic to understand and adjust their lives to work better within them. I think it was him who gave a vignette of an engineer who needed an assistant to organise everything for him, and he would often become so anxious on the tram going to work that he completely decompensated. And one of the strategies was to develop written things. Get off the tram at 13, be calm until then. Yep, get off the tram at stop 13, be calm until then. And he'd just read it. Get off the tram at 12, 13. Okay, off I go. This is a person who owned an engineering company, but the visual cues just work really well for these people. Struggle with change and variation of routine. So in my practice for kids, whenever a teacher goes on long service leave, I know we've just lost 6 weeks of learning. And if we're not doing our job right, other kids have lost some learning too, because these kids decompensate and take way more of the relief teacher's time. Because change is difficult. The start of every year is difficult for these kids, and it takes them a period of time to settle in and become productive in work. So even if they've got a decent IQ, they sometimes underperform because the anxiety is so difficult for them around change. Those beautiful families that I was talking about that don't know that their kid's got autism, but they've just come into a pattern where they know that James needs to sit there, Harry needs to sit there, and we all have to have our seats and the same cutlery and the same plates every day. Yep. Because if we don't have that, we have a more difficult time. And they just do it. They just evolve into this without even realising. And to a certain extent, that's okay, because that's a loving family who is responding to their child's needs, and I think that's beautiful. I think we need to be helping people with autism to learn change slowly and in a supportive way that they can deal with, because the world is not going to revolve around them for their whole life. Yep. And so developing some resilience and acceptance and knowledge that this change, I know it's making me feel bad, I know it will end, and dealing with it is important as well. One of the, I think it's a two-edged sword, is the sense of fairness and righteous indignation when the rules are broken is something which is striking about kids with autism. So these are the dobbers, they're the dobbers. So if a kid's done something over there, this will be the kid who goes and tells the teacher, and in their own way, partly I think it's disappearing, but certainly in our culture, Australia was not a nation of dobbers. And so we're getting better at that, or worse, I don't know. But that sense of breaking the rules being a problem is difficult. And whenever I get a child who is like this, who is just out of the blue, exploding and completely, parents use the word meltdown. And I've seen my own kids throw tantrums, but I think a meltdown's more impressive, more nuclear than a tantrum. But one of the things I ask families to do is go back and look, because there's probably a rule that's been broken. I often think that a kid like this lives with two rule books. One rule book is for everyone else, and there's often a second rule book which is the rule book for them. And when a rule is broken, it offends the most deep part of their core. And if they haven't learnt to express it in a more pro-social way, it will often come as a big explosion. And one of the jobs we have as carers and professionals and parents and friends and teachers of these kids, one of the really important jobs we have is to rewrite the most dysfunctional rules. Because these people have to be adults one day, and they have to participate in society. And if they have a tantrum and a meltdown when they're 26 years of age, it is just not going to be acceptable. They will not hold work. They will not hold relationships. They will suffer. And so, again, it's a little bit like social stories and theory of mind training for these kids. It's not easy. It's not quick. But by simply stating the truth, a clear and unambiguous truth of what is acceptable in this family, and saying, no, she is allowed to jump on the trampoline for 5 minutes because you jumped on the trampoline for 5 minutes, and just accept the meltdown's going to happen. But once the child's calm, go back and restate what the rule is. The rule is that everybody's allowed to jump on the trampoline and everybody gets 5 minutes. And we bought the egg timer, so suck it up, sunshine. Don't say that last bit, it'll just heighten things. But that sense of rules and justice is very important. But the other thing which I've never read about, but I keep seeing as an echo, because many of these children's parents who have autism also have at least autistic traits themselves. And one of the things that's striking about them is that the other part of that sense of justice and fairness is the sense of betrayal they have when somebody lets them down, and the deep difficulty they have in forgiving. And one of the things I see, even in my own kids as they go from age 3 to age 17, is the circle of friends get sacked because they let them down. And one of the most important rules that needs to be rewritten for people with autism child or adult, is that everybody makes mistakes. Everybody lets us down, and it's important that we forgive. It's important, and it's important that we forgive, because otherwise you're going to be very lonely. Yep. And these parents of kids with autism have very few friends. Tight circle, and if a friend betrays them, they're gone. The other part of it is, the other part of justice and fairness and rules is that when we apply tight boundaries, they usually tight expectations which are predictable and never allowed to stray, is that they'll deal well with those kinds of, not all of them, but many of them will deal well with that environment. It feels safe, they know the rules, it's easier. The other part of it is that not all of them, some kids just don't want anything, they're not interested, but other kids, life is a series of deals. Yep. So you want something, you give me something. Now, that's also hard for parents, because I don't want to parent my non-autistic kids like that. I want them to be generous, and I want them to do things because we have a social contract which says that that's actually your role in the world. And it's difficult to parent an autistic kid when you have non-autistic kids. But if you actually need an autistic kid to do something, bribery is highly effective. Yep. And the bribery should be cost effective, and it should be developmentally appropriate. So for younger kids it can be sticker charts and all that sort of stuff, and you don't want to bankrupt yourself, but bribery works. The transactional nature, everything's transactional. So relationships are transactional. What they would call friendships is transactional. Their eventual partners, there will be more of an aspect of transactional relationship with those people than other people will experience. Sex, for some of them, will be relatively transactional. Give me something, get something. Many of these kids have odd patterns of play, and you will have heard about some of this stuff. So when I'm asking about how does your child play, oh, he plays with trucks. Well, that's fine, but some kids can play with trucks in a highly imaginative way, where they get down on the ground and they're driving along and they say hello to Mrs. McGillicuddy, and then they pick up the rubbish and all that, and they make up a story. And it's not a story they've heard that they're just repeating, it's actually imaginative. Whereas other kids with trucks will just spin the wheel. And it's the fascinating thing is spinning the wheel. That's different. Now that's interesting, and there's physics and there's all that sort of stuff, and it's not like there's nothing to it, but it is qualitatively different way of playing with the truck and not imaginative. Imaginative play comes much later for many kids with autism. It's a spectrum, they're not all the same. It's just Let's talk about the epidemiology. So this is Centres for Disease Control data. Back in the 90s, there were papers being written that described 0.7 per 10,000 population in the United Kingdom. Now, that's probably under-recognising things a bit. And it does depend on, so we rely on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a blunt instrument. And we can sometimes shoehorn people into that diagnosis who 10 years ago we would have just called a slightly odd child and just get on with it. And I think that reflects some of it. There are some true trends which predict for an increase in the prevalence of autism. One of them is older fathers is a risk factor, and there are others as well, but I think that's a talk for another day. But the data...
How much older, Penny?
How much older? I think it's linear. Yeah. So I at age 47 would expect that for me, I don't know the stats, but I would have a higher risk of producing an autistic child. But I don't think it's like Trisomy 21 where it does that. I think it's linear, but I might be wrong. So 1 in 68, and the same data, if you look at boys, it's 1 in 42, and girls 1 in 189. Now, it's easy to be cynical, and it's easy to say 1 in 42, really? Really? And I don't know if that's a fair figure or not, but if I as a I as a clinician, the first thing I'd ask is, does this boy have a problem that requires some help? And then I'd start down the criteria for autism spectrum disorder, or I wouldn't. It's less than 1 in a class. It's probably about right. Most teachers now who have well and truly got their eyes in for this will say that they think there's probably 1 in every class, and sometimes 2. But that's what the stats say. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about how girls are so much better at communication than boys and how their autism is relatively more difficult to diagnose. I think there's truth in that. I don't know what it'll mean for how we assess autism in females later on. It's always been about a 5-to-1 ratio, 4.85, something like that ratio between boys and girls, all right the way through the first diagnosis, first description of autism. So if monozygotic twins show 60% concordance, so there is something genetic to it, and 92% if you're autistic disorder, and this is back in the DSM-4 days this was published, and if you look for more of a spectrum of traits and things like that, 92% concordance, and 10% concordance with the old-fashioned form of autism, but if they're dizygotic or siblings. But if you look at other traits of autism, it's still there in 30%. And I think that's right in my clinical practice. So when we find, I call it the index case, there'll be quite a few of those families who then start looking around and recognising it in the dad, who never wants to know about it, and sometimes does, and starting to recognise traits in the kids. And one of the hard things for those families is yes, this child has autism and this one has traits, but probably doesn't meet the diagnostic threshold. That's hard for them because they're seeing what this kid's getting in terms of help. There's funding. There's quite a lot of funding. There's increasing amounts of funding. And yet, if you've got traits, there's not a whole lot out there. Now, if you've got independent means, that probably doesn't matter very much. But actually, for most families, paying $176 per hour for allied health is a big expense and not practical. This is NDIS data, 2015. And in case I know that the text is small, and I apologise for that, but this is cerebral palsy. 5% of NDIS funded people in 2015 had cerebral palsy. Deafness and hearing loss accounted for about 2%. And all the others you can sort of guess. Intellectual disability was 16% and autism was 31%. So NDIS, the public thinks it's people in wheelchairs, but it's not. It's most of the disability we are substantially funding is for people with autism spectrum disorder. Now, that's expensive, and we have to therefore, we as clinicians have to be thoughtful about the label. We're dealing with the public's precious treasure. We're dealing with people who pay taxes and work hard to do so, and we need to treat that with respect. And we can't just therefore give everyone a label because it suits the families. We actually have an important, GPs know this better than I do, the concept of gatekeeper has been something that you guys have inculcated long ago, and you do very well. I as a specialist need to get my head increasingly around it. Because when there's funding for one thing and not for another, it's a bit corrupting unless we have ways to defend ourselves and be careful about the diagnoses we give. This is carers' allowances, and this is for autism and Asperger's using the DSM-4 descriptions. And you can see that for the yellow, which is the 10s to 14s, and the 5 to 9s, which is the red, it's gone through the roof. I tell you, I have filled these forms out exactly the same way since I first started training in paediatrics in 1997, but they've changed. The department has changed. Centrelink has changed. And although I filled it out the same way as I did back then, they would all have been knocked back in 97, 98, 99, and many of them, sometimes I actually raise my eyebrows and think, really? Really?
I've actually had Centrelink ring me up and say, you need to change the answer to that question so that your patient can get the benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
Couldn't
they,
believe it.
you know, and for the recording, the Centrelink does that. They do ring and sometimes ask us to change things because I think some of that cultural change is a good thing. It used to be a no until you appealed and appealed and appealed and got a yes, and if you were disempowered through low intellect, depression or anything, then you simply didn't get the funding. But if you were a type A personality who was going to get it, then you got it. I think it's fairer now, but there is a cost. There is a cost at the margin where it's very easy to get carers allowance compared to how it used to be. As recently as today, yesterday morning, I had a parent come to me whose child has ADD and nothing else, wanting me to fill out a carers form. And up until now, nobody gets funding for carers for ADD, although it can take a bit of time because you do have to watch them around traffic and a few things like that. But if that gets on, boy, that's going to double again. Anyway. So is autism, is it all about those at the margin, the marginal, slightly odd kids? No. My own clinical experience is that many of the kids who have always had an intellectual disability and failure to engage, we've always just kind of accepted. We've sent them along to the specialist school. We've done our best to help them with, making sure that their vitamin D and all that stayed okay, but we've left it at that. But now we're increasingly looking at the DSM and we're going, well, actually the communication is out of proportion with the other aspects of deficit for these kids that have a lot of deficits. And I think that's where this severe and profound autism increase is coming along. But actually, if you draw a line between them, the more subtle forms of autism is also increasing. Both. So how do we make a diagnosis? It's a judgment call, and it's a judgment call which you hold up against the DSM criteria, and it is easy to be swayed. And if a parent walks in with a strong agenda to get a diagnosis for whatever reason, if you've read the criteria and you can spin a good story, it's easy to be swayed. So one of the ways we try, I think it's important to have a robust diagnosis, is to have at least 2 and often 3 professionals independently look at this child and, let's say, his family and reach their own conclusions. And they're often referred to me first, and that's fine, and I think that's an important role. And then I'll actually look at this kid and think, is this mostly about sensory things? Is it mostly about communication things? What's the big thing? And so I'll often pick either an occupational therapist or a speech therapist to provide an assessment. And I'll often involve a psychologist as well for 2 reasons: to independently look and tell me if they think that there is autism, but also I find WISCs and WIPSIs, which are 2 forms of intellectual assessment that are done in children. I find that helpful as well because there are often unusual subscores of IQ with better performance in, say, shape and block design and worse performance in communication and stuff like that. So that's helpful as well. But it should be multi-professional. About once a year, once every 2 years, there will be a child who walks into my room who, as they're walking through the door, I say, that's autism. Now, I usually won't name it as autism. I'll usually be thoughtful and think about other things and make sure I'm not missing stuff. And if they're older than 12 and the diagnosis for funding is different once you're over the age of 12, once a year, once every 2 years, I'll just make the diagnosis and work with it from there. But pretty much for everybody else, it should be multi-D. And as early as possible. Now, the literature says that actually there is a role, the younger the better, in intervening for kids with autism, particularly to have them ready to turn up on the first day of school, ready to learn, anxiety managed, understanding some social cues so that they don't completely end up isolated quickly. There is a role. So early intervention has a role. Earlier the better. But there's a downside to this. I'm going to call it diagnostic safety. The younger we diagnose a child, the less safe the diagnosis is. It can be other things that looks like autism. It can be severe attachment disorder. It could be severe iron deficiency. It could be other things. It could be a desperately understimulated environment, which means that they don't talk because their parents don't talk, or the TV's going 24 hours a day. Yeah, question?
What age would you call it early?
Or in my own practice, I am uncomfortable and I think twice, and I try to be very diligent in what I do. I try to be diligent anyway, but I try really hard to make sure I'm not missing something below 2. Once they're above 2, then the speech is becoming clearer and clearer. And one of my experiences of autism, of the younger you diagnose it, the more subtle it is. But it's like, this is just so true of autism, with the social stuff, the anxiety stuff, the communication stuff, it becomes more and more obvious as they go. So I often find myself agonising about this 3.5 or 4-year-old child and thinking, is this just anxiety or is this autism? And I'll do my best to offer an assessment, and I might call it autism, and up until now, touch wood, I think I've got it right for the patients I followed. By the time they're 7 or 8, it is clearly autism, where I agonised at the time of diagnosis. But the other part of it is, sometimes I will say, with the best assessment, and this is a change that I've made in my practice in the last 5 years, with the best assessment I can offer you today, in 2017, with your 4-year-old child, I can't find enough to diagnose autism, and then I say the word yet. Now, I don't need the work. I don't want more referrals. It's not like I'm stringing them along so I can get them to come back more times or anything. But I think it's important to say that because it becomes more obvious. And I've been asked to assess them, and the worst, I can think of many people I know who are clearly, I can think of a few, autistic adults, barn door autistic adults. And when I gently mention to them, do you know you've got a lot of trays? And what they say to me is, nah, I was assessed at age 4, I'm not autistic. And I just go, oh. And I'm talking about some doctors I know. Yeah. By the way, autism is overrepresented amongst the medical profession. Yes, your question was, well, there's so many parents, paraphrasing you, there are many parents now, because parents talk and there is Facebook and there are all those sorts of things. Parents talk and they will bring their child that they are worried about at a young age. And the question is it wiser to wait and watch until it is clearer and a safer diagnosis can be made? That's your question. The thing is, if there is autism, and we're correct in the diagnosis, and we can diagnose it at 18 months, and there's actually some research going about eye contact and stuff as early as like 3 months, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. But if we can diagnose it, the earlier we diagnose it and the earlier we start to intervene, my understanding of the literature is the better the outcomes. So what I'd like to do is, I'd like not to wait. But here's the easy thing, I'd like no unnecessary referrals, please. My suggestion for a wise and common sense approach to that is seek corroborating information from other people who know the child and know children. And so that'll often be a childcare worker or somebody like that. You have to go gently, because many childcare workers are very reluctant to tell you that they think a child's autistic because it's not their place. And so I'm careful when I word my questions to them. It's not, do you think this kid has autism because I need to make a referral or not? It's, tell me about this child. What makes this child tick? Open questions. Let's hear the colour of the child. And then, compared to all the other child, would you say this child stands out in any way, giving them a chance to talk about it without being threatening? Have you ever had a child? Does this have an echo with autism? Does this child have an echo of a child with autism? I'm not asking you to diagnose them, but just kind of getting that sort of stuff. Have you noticed a difference in the quality of their communication, in the quality of the play, the way they play? You know, because they're trained, many of them are excellently trained in early childhood intervention, they will have noticed. But if we ask, do we think they have autism, it's often a fruitless question for me. But if you start to get enough of that sort of stuff to think, well, somebody who knows children and knows this child thinks this child's different, then I would suggest maybe it's worth making a referral. Because the earlier we make the diagnosis, the better. The other thing I say to parents is, when I'm making a diagnosis, particularly a young diagnosis, I say, look, with the best ability I have and with the independent assessment of this person and this person, I think your child has autism. And when I write the letter, I'm going to be unambiguous that this child, after a multidisciplinary assessment, your child has autism. But actually, I have to tell you, I'm human. And it's possible that I'm wrong. If I'm right, I think I know the trajectory your child's going to follow, and in 2 years there'll be no doubt about it that we were right, that your child has autism. But if I'm wrong, I will apologise to you. I will write a letter saying I was wrong and saying that that is not an appropriate diagnosis for your child, and we will take it away. Yeah, because if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. And I think it's important to say that, particularly with the young kids, because one day I'm going to get it wrong. So the question was about outcomes. The outcomes aren't always good, that there are many factors, and the factors you've just raised are the quality of the intervention and the quality of the carer. I would say that is correct and correct. I'd say there are many other outcomes, and one of the outcomes, I would use the word the substrate. So if you're destined to have the worst, most debilitating form of autism, we can help. We can reduce anxiety, but we will simply stop you from being a quivering mess, rocking in the corner, to maybe getting to some form of supported education sometimes. So we will get a better outcome, but we won't get a perfect outcome. There are some, I feel like a poet, there are some things we can change and some things we can't, but the things we can change, we should change for the better, and we know that trajectories will improve. The trajectories will never be perfect. But we can make it better. And we can make it better in another way. I can tell you, if we're talking about the worst kind of autism, this is desperately difficult for families. It breaks down relationships. Thinking about the most challenging patients I have, one of the recurring things is that the relationship between the parents breaks down. And sometimes there's nothing I can do that will stop that. But one of the things I can do as a clinician is help that family cope with the child that they've been given. And I think that's an important role as well. And it can improve outcomes for them as well as the child.
Just one other question, Andy. What do you see as Interreach's role?
Interreach's role. Well, I've sat and I've tried to... so the question for the recording is, what do I think Interreach's role is? So I've sat and I've tried to listen to how Interreach is trying to work with people with autism. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think its most important role at the moment is to get these people enrolled and appropriately assessed for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Because intervention helps. Intervention helps for the child, and although it's not a purpose of the NDIS, it actually also helps for the carers of the child. I think that's the main role, and let's just go from there. Is that a fair answer for 2017? And I hope it becomes much broader. Go on.
Apparently they have their own allied health people, speech therapists and OTs and all that sort of thing that are working with them. So I was just wondering if they're unable to get them through you guys,
Yep.
Is that an alternative?
Okay, so I'll talk about ways to access help later. But there are, so for the purposes of the recording, you've just made comment that there are speech therapists. I wasn't aware that Interreach was offering services as well as providing assessments and case planning and all that sort of stuff. But there are a number of organisations out there that are providing and standing ready to provide services to these kids, and I wouldn't seek to give preference to one over another.
What is Interreach?
Okay, so Interreach is, I only know from the outside, so the main way, what is Interreach? What I do know is Interreach is one of the agencies that holds a contract in this area to help prepare people to get onto the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is a process with several parts. And so there's pre-interviews, and then there's interviews, and then there's case planning, and then there's revisions of case planning, and I'm not an expert in NDIS, and so I get nervous answering these questions because there's probably other people in the room who know this better than I do. I didn't know this, but Interreach also sounds like it's got a therapeutic arm as well, and if I was thinking about that, I would think of something similar to Noah's Ark, which has provided early intervention services and allied health services and scope, and there are probably others, and I apologise if I don't remember names of organisations, but it's like there is an earthquake occurring beneath our feet at the moment, because everything we knew and all the organisations we had dealing with these children are being thrown up into the air, and they will all fall down in a very different way over the next few years because the funding has changed through NDIS, and it will probably end up better, but there's just some uncomfortable things as we go through that process. Does anybody else, because I know I'm not an expert in the questions I've just been asked, does anybody have anything better to say in terms of an opinion or... No? Okay. So my investigations, I think another role for doctors is to not miss some medical mimics, because other people won't think of that stuff. And so I will ask for an FB and iron studies, because they'll often be iron deficient. It won't be the cause of all their symptoms, but iron deficiency in the first few years certainly causes irritability. And if you remain iron deficient at a deep enough level for long enough, it actually costs IQ points, which are not recoverable. And if they've come from certain areas, such as mining towns, then there is a possibility that they might be lead toxic. I won't do typically lead levels unless they come from an area where lead toxicity has been endemic, or they like to chew non-nutritious things. So an example would be that they're living in a house that was built before 1976. That increases the risk, because all that shiny white paint on the door frames had lead in it before 1976, 1974, something mid-70s. Now, there might have been a completely, but doctor, it's been renovated, yes, but they rubbed all that white paint off, which fell into the carpet, and there are reflex of it still there. Or the white paint on the outside has fallen into the top 2 centimetres of soil, and the kid loves eating soil. So older houses, it's not a big risk, but we know it's a risk. The other thing you should know about lead is that it's sweet. And if a child discovers lead somewhere, like on a door frame, they like chewing it because it tastes sweet. And that's one of the aspects of pica. We find pica is the chewing of non-nutritive substances. So there'll often be, there'll be a reason why they've chosen the things they're chewing, and sometimes we just need to be mindful of lead. I checked the organ systems. Thyroid would be the one that I don't want to miss, because I don't want to miss hypothyroidism causing impaired development. That would be bad to miss. So I'm interested in thyroid, liver function and urea and creatinine. I do them, but in preparing, when I'm teaching my juniors, I'm always asking them, why are you doing that test? Give me a good reason. What are you going to do with the result? And then I'm really embarrassed to say, when I was preparing for this test, I'm having trouble remembering why I ordered them. They turn up stuff, and so occasionally there will be an AST and an ALT that are elevated because they're really seriously fat and they've got NASH at a young age and so on. And so it turns things up, but I reserve the right to change my mind on those. Creatine kinase is very important. So creatine kinase in boys, because you can have a form of muscular dystrophy, and before the weakness, you've got vague forms of developmental disability, which may be seen as global, and some people may interpret to be autism spectrum disorder. So we generally will order a creatine kinase. And I think this site will probably change in 5 years' time, but the state of the art at the moment is to request an SMP microarray. Do you want me to give you a 15-second view on that? Yeah, okay. So SMP microarray, if you think, forgive me if you heard me talk about this before, I think of the DNA as being like a set of encyclopedias. And if you think of 23 books or whatever chromosomes, we have the capacity to detect duplications and deletions across the DNA to the level of paragraphs in an encyclopedia. So, and when I'm testing for this purpose, query autism, about 1 in 8 of the tests I send off come back with an abnormality in the DNA. Now, as you'll remember from your medical school days, or possibly more recently, most of our DNA is what we think. We don't like using the term junk anymore because we realise it probably does have a role, but it doesn't have a major function. So most of the duplications and deletions in the DNA we have don't seem to have any clinical correlation that we can recognise. And so about 1 in 8 will come back, and the result will say something like, we found a duplication on chromosome 22p11.3. I just made that up. And it was 0.5 megabases long, which would be 500 sort of base pairs long, duplication or deletion. And then the next thing it'll say is, in the world literature, we only have 2 or 3 of these children, and we don't know what it means. And can you please send the parents' DNA? Because one of the things that is helpful, one day this actually might mean something, and we might realise and call it Lovett syndrome, I wish. But the state of the art in 2017 is that we will send parents' DNA if we can get consent, because one day this might have implications, but we'll send parents' DNA. Because if the parents, I would use the words, if the parents are happy taxpayers, so they're contributing to the world, they don't have any identifiable major diseases and so on, then this DNA, and they share the mutation, then this DNA problem probably doesn't have any clinical correlation. Sometimes when you look at the father, you think, no, you really are autistic as well, but you don't raise it. And so actually it might have something to it. But and that's what we do. And then I generally send them to genetic counselling, because there'll be a lot that I don't know. And so if I find an abnormality, that's what we'll often get. Sometimes, occasionally, I get surprised, and so I send DNA and it comes back Klinefelter syndrome. And I didn't realise it until I had my first case like this, and it's happened to me a few times now, where Klinefelter syndrome has about 30% of the children and adults with that condition have an autistic type personality. And the way I picked it was by doing a microarray without thinking that I was going to find Klinefelter syndrome. And sometimes the result comes back with something like, we found a mutation on chromosome whatever, point whatever, and this is associated with intellectual disability, and by the way, you should do an echo because it's associated with HOCM as well. And it can be that specific. Now that's not common, that's going to become more common as the databases increase, but they're the kinds of results we get. It's helpful with that echo one, and it can sometimes, even if it's that mutation and we don't know what it means, some parents find that helpful. It gives them a narrative, whether it's correct or not, it gives them a narrative about why. There's risk to it. Sometimes parents feel great guilt that they've passed it on to their child, even if it doesn't seem to be affecting the child in any way. And one day, somebody's going to be refused income insurance or life insurance because there's a genetic difference. And so I'm making a big effort to get informed consent before I do these tests now. To the best of my knowledge, it hasn't happened yet, but it will happen.
Nobody has perfect genes.
Nobody has perfect genes, yes. Present company accepted. Yeah.
Just a question, Andy. So do you expect for a 2.5-year-old child who walks through the room with possible behavioural issues, possible autism spectrum, possible something, to have the whole area of tests before we do a referral to you?
I think if you want to, I think that's fine. If I thought this was a behavioural problem and not an autistic problem, I wouldn't necessarily do these tests. So I wait until I formulate the thought. There's a couple of reasons I'll do a microarray test. For some very specific conditions. For example, if the child has a VSD and an ASD or something like that, actually the probability now of having something genetic that we're not going to find any other way is high enough that I think it's worthwhile doing. I'll do it. I use the 3 strikes, you're out. So if I find 3 abnormalities, I'll generally do a genetic test, and that can be as subtle as clydodactyly, abnormal kidneys, and bifid uvula. I don't know, I just made those up as well. But if you've got 3 things, I'll think that it's reasonable to do a microarray, and I do it for query autism. The reason I wouldn't do it on everybody who walks in my door is, unless it's changed, that costs $600 of my taxes. Yeah, and so I don't want to do it on everyone because I think I have a responsibility as a steward of public resources to be thoughtful in how I do it.
But that's everything else.
Yeah, if tests were perfect, I'd say do these tests on every child, but they're not perfect. We'll find that slightly elevated AST and ALT, which will be 10 above the upper limit of the normal range, and then we'll find ourselves doing hepatitis B and C serology, and then we'll find ourselves looking for autoimmune hepatitis. You know what I mean? So I'd encourage you to have a good reason to do any test you want to do, and don't do tests without a good reason. If your referral question to me is, do you think this is autism? If I agree with you, yeah, well, I'm going to do the test. And so if you're pretty confident that you think it's going to be, then yeah, get them going, because it'll save a visit.
Yeah.
It'll save a visit. But if it's kind of, I don't really think it is, but the parents are asking for a referral, maybe hold off, because a lot of those I'll divert and say, can I see your child in a year's time and rethink it? And I won't do any tests. And then the child in a year's time might be quite normal. Yeah.
With the lead levels, I've seen a couple of parents recently who were on the lead thing, and certainly one with a baby with lead levels at the upper end of normal.
Yeah.
If the lead levels are done and if they're high, and how is that fixed, and if it is fixed, does that resolve the problem?
Yeah, so again, it's moving into a specific area of treatment that I would consider myself a professional and not an expert. So other people might have a better answer than me, but I'll give you the best answer I understand at the moment. There are environmental interventions that occur at certain lead levels, and there is chelation therapy at other lead levels. We don't really know for sure what a safe level of lead is, and the numbers that are published in Australia are higher than other countries would consider as safe. I would be reluctant to chelate a child without a very good reason and very high lead levels, but the Department of Health at certain levels, and I don't know the thresholds, will actually help a family to change their environment to reduce lead. And I'll tell you what I would do as a parent if I had a child who had elevated lead levels. I would go out of my way, I would move house, I would move suburb, I would do what I had to do to try and find environmental changes that will reduce my child's lead level, because it probably does matter. It is my best understanding. But it's usually environmental. There'll usually be lead in the carpet, lead in the soil, lead somewhere, and you've got to find where the lead is. In places like Mount Isa, where lead is ubiquitous, they'll come and they'll put a foot of topsoil on top of the current garden as a way of mitigating it, because they can't get rid of it, it's everywhere. Any other questions? Okay. So what do I do? In preschool, early intervention has value, and the real emphasis, well, I put the emphasis on communication and socialisation, and that's true, but it's also about supporting the family and starting the journey with this family of having a child who's going to be different to other children. And mostly the work, I would consider my role to be overseeing the work, but most of the work is done by allied health and good kindergarten teachers. At primary school, by far and away, the playground is the most difficult place, because at least there are some rules in the classroom. So they're often really, really at sea. And one of the things I see of kids who have autism spectrum disorder, the sleep problems start in primary school. And if I encourage parents, put your ear up to the door. Yep, because they'll take 2.5 or 3 hours to go to sleep, and many of them will replay the day. And they'll go over particularly the playground and try and work out. Oliver Sacks wrote a book, and in the book was called An Anthropologist on Mars, and that was a quote he used about a very insightful person who had autism, who was talking about her experience of what it was like to have autism. It's like I'm an anthropologist on Mars. She sees all these chaotic, complex, nuanced human interactions, and she's like a person making notes on it. She doesn't really get it. She's not a part of it. She watches it. She thinks it's really interesting, and she tries to decode it. And kids in the playground, it's like that for many of them. They don't get it. Ideally, you'll encourage them. I encourage parents to identify 1 or 2 nice kids, usually of the same gender. It's very deliberate that I encourage friendships of the same gender, because as they go through primary school and they hit early adolescence, cross-gender friendships often fall apart. These friendships often fall apart anyway, but cross-gender friendships will often fall apart in early adolescence. And so if you're going to have a kid that's going to be your wingman right through, same gender is better. And shamelessly manipulate to have those friendships grow. So have those children around, use your skills, skills training. So I often talk about being like a footy coach. So you define a length of time that this friend is going to come around, and usually 45 minutes is a good time. And you have a pre-game sort of talk with your child about when Billy comes over, what are we going to do? And you plan the play experience. And what are we going to focus on today? I want you to focus on asking him what he wants to do.
Tackling.
Okay, say again.
Not tackling?
No, not tackling. Well, tackling's good sometimes because boys need that. They're like, but anyway, so and so that's the pre-game, and then Billy comes over, and then I say your job is now like a runner running onto the football field, and so you watch, you let them do whatever play they're doing, and but every now and then when you see the other kid sort of starting to struggle with the social interaction, you run on and you whisper and you try and make it 5 words or less. Yep, don't forget to take turns, and then run off. Yep, and it's like a trainer on a football field. And then at the end of it, you don't make it last too long, because the other kid will probably go for 45 minutes okay, but if you put them together for 2.5 hours, the other kid's going to get bored. And if the other kid leaves thinking that was boring, he's going to be less likely to come back next time. So you keep it short. And at the end, you use bribery, so you drive through the McDonald's drive-through and you get a little cone of ice cream, so that the other kid goes home thinking, geez, that was all right, so that they're more likely to come back next time. And then afterwards, after that social encounter, you do a post-game analysis where you sit down with your child and say, how'd that go? What went well? What will we do differently next time? You're coaching them. This comes naturally to everyone else, but you coach these kids. You work on their social engagement, and you grow those kids, and you grow those friends, and you pick nice friends from nice families, and you grow them. Yep. And you're shameless about it. Because then, when your child is in the playground and all at sea, he can pick someone that he knows, and he can go and be with them. And although he won't exactly fit in, the other kid will sort of shepherd him a bit, look after him a bit, help him a bit. It works. So socialisation is the most difficult. Trying to find the integration is part of the same thing. Trying to find their strengths. One of the things that I encourage families to do for these kinds of kids is try and find something that they can develop a deep mastery of, because that actually might be their ticket for life. They might be Bill Gates writing Microsoft Word. I don't know what they will do, but try and find the thing that they're really good at. Try and find the thing that defines them, that they're proud of, that they can stand up and say, I'm blah and I love lizards and this is my pet lizard. Yep. Something that they're passionate about, because that sense of meaning, that sense of place is so important in their child who's otherwise so often at sea. So try and find something they're passionate about. Ideally, in an ideal world, it would be something that you could shepherd into a future career. And computer games really don't seem to go very far. At secondary school, I think the hardest time in my clinical experience for kids with autism is from halfway through grade 6 to halfway through year 9. And I don't think anything has changed for those kids, but I think life changes for the kids around them. So a task of early adolescence is to be like everyone else. And if you're not like everyone else, it's a problem. So I remember when I was in year 7 and I was at school, I wore a lemon-coloured jumper because everyone wore lemon-coloured jumpers back then. Every boy in the whole bloody class wore a lemon-coloured jumper because we needed to fit in the same. Now, one of the flip sides to that need to be like everyone else is somewhere deep in the subconscious, if you're hanging around with someone who is different, some of that difference rubs off. And so, it's often a time when even the most beautiful, lovely friendships fall apart. And these kids end up isolated. And a few other things happen. Sarcasm becomes a big thing, and yet sarcasm is not a strength. They tend to be literal for much longer. And so the jokes they don't get. And they'll laugh inappropriately, and the other kids will go loser and mark them as different. And so for lots and lots of reasons, they end up quite socially isolated. Anxiety comes up very high, school refusal kicks in. Particularly at the start of year 7, because so much change is occurring anyway. They're socially isolated. It's pretty bloody awful for them. And so dealing with that time, and I would say in my clinical experience, I would say more than half reach criteria for a major anxiety disorder. And many will have significant depressive symptoms. And so we need to work through that. That doesn't mean they're going to have it all their life, although anxiety is a part of autism. But it's going to go for a while. Once they get past that, year 9, if we can support them and keep them with a sense of integrity and self-belief through to the middle of year 9, the next developmental phase in the other adolescence kicks in and they are much better accepted. And so if you can just get them through engaged to the middle of year 9, they usually kick on. And because they can be quirky, they can be interesting, they'll often be the slightly odd one at the party, but you know, if you've done them well, they'll come back in. And then I start talking about career planning. You know, what are you going to do? There are some things like front of house, customer service, which these kids don't do so well. But there are other things, like there are computer companies now who very specifically recruit autistic people because they're better for task, for analysis and stuff like that. And so we start to talk about where's their IQ, where's their interest, where's their learning. And I think that is part of my job. I'd happily outsource it if anybody knows anybody better who could do that job. One of the things that I find very predictable is that parents, particularly separated parents, are at deep odds about this diagnosis. And my clinical experience is it's often the absent male who simply will not accept anything other than this child just needs to mature a bit. And in one sense, it's true. In one sense, autism is an aspect of maturity which will come later with a lot of work compared to other kids. So it's not like that's completely incorrect, but without help, I actually think the gap's bigger over time. And one of the things which often strikes me about medicine as being different to other disciplines like teaching and psychology is that the discipline I was trained in is completely atheoretical. We're trained as doctors to be mostly empirical thinkers. You know, what is the evidence? How can I best implement it? If I don't have any evidence for this, well, what other evidence do I think would inform and help me direct where I'm going to go? Sometimes we'll fall back to the best we've got, which is experience and clinical anecdote, because we're in a completely evidence-free zone, but that's kind of how we work. Whereas teachers and psychologists and naturopaths and all sorts of other people train from a deep form, and midwives, can I say, put a lot of effort into the philosophy of practice. And the philosophy of some teachers in my clinical experience is a philosophy of look for the best in every child, which is lovely and beautiful, and I want that kind of teacher for my kids, but those teachers struggle when we give a child labels. And when we ask them about a child, the only thing they can report to us is the most beautiful and wonderful parts, which is true, but the kid also has some problems. And if we don't know them and we don't deal with them, we're going to have trouble moving forward. So sometimes, not all teachers, but some teachers are a challenge. And sometimes what I have to do is say, I need to see a child next year with a fresh set of eyes at school because the story I'm getting is incongruous. Sleep will become a problem. I don't really know if there is a melatonin deficiency or not, but a lot of these kids have a lot of trouble inducing sleep. And it goes through to adulthood, but I don't treat adults. But from around about early to mid primary school, induction of sleep's a difficulty. We know that it's made worse with the exposure to blue light. We know that screens are a problem. So there are all those things, and all of you should not have phones in your room unless you're on call, because it will be affecting your own sleep. Because here's what you'll be doing. You'll be rolling over, picking up your phone and just checking the headlines. You'll expose yourself to light, and then you'll have trouble getting back to sleep. Get rid of your phones.
Just be lying and hoping it doesn't ring.
Anyway, so sleep will be a problem, and so there is good published evidence for the use of melatonin in children with autism. There is not a lot of evidence for the use of melatonin in other kids. Yeah. So we should be careful about using melatonin all day, every day for every child we see. We should be working on the sleep hygiene stuff far more than we do. But in autism there is a role, and the role is up to 6 milligrams. And you can prescribe the Circadin, which is fine. That's made in Israel. It's been through all the right channels, and we know it's safe, but it's just very expensive. It's almost $1 a tablet. And they're 2 milligram tablets, and if you're using 6, that ends up being very expensive. There are other places to get it, so I don't like talking about one company above another company, but in Bendigo, the Amcal pharmacy out at Kennington will produce a compounded product, which is, I think she does a 5 milligram capsule, a 3 milligram capsule, and a liquid. And that's much cheaper than the Circadin. The downside of that is that the Circadin is a long-acting product, whereas the stuff that the Amcal pharmacy makes is not. But most of the problem with autism is about sleep induction anyway, so it's probably not a big loss. And there are plenty of other places to get it, including male pharmacies down in Melbourne and other places as well. Has a role, has a good role. It's a private script. It's not on PBS, of course. I think it's entirely reasonable for GPs to prescribe it. My best understanding, and someone else can pipe up if they know other literature, the best understanding I have is that there's some evidence in dogs that puberty is induced about 3 months earlier with melatonin in prepubescent dogs. And there is some suggestion in a few studies that if you have severe crippling depression, the use of melatonin can make it worse. And I don't think it's like Valium. As far as I can see in the literature I've read is that it doesn't form a tolerance, and therefore it doesn't form a dependence. Anxiety I've talked about, and social isolation kicks in around about grade 6. Very predictable. And it's funny, I talk to families and I say, if you are willing to allow me, I would like to follow your child across time. If you don't want me to, it would be good to have a paediatrician follow your child across time. And then I say, this is what I think is going to happen. And I say, I think your child will struggle in the playground. And I'm talking about a 2-year-old, you know, in prep and grade 1. I think your child will have trouble with friends progressively through school, but there will be an awful time here and so on. It's a big thing to give to them, but I kind of outlined why do I think I need to follow your child, and this is why, because there are things I think will come. And one of the most disappointing things to me is when a paediatrician makes a diagnosis, gives them the label, gets them funding and says it's no longer my problem. I think that's really disappointing. I think they're letting the child down. I think we have a role. But I think that role can also be played if GPs are interested in autism. I think that there's nothing special I do. It's not like I'm prescribing stimulants that needs a paediatrician. If GPs are interested in, they can do this just as well as I can. Anyway, so my principles of management, I've talked about it. I try to find their strengths and allow them the space to grow them and become wonderful at them. I try and identify their weaknesses, and they'll never be fantastic, but I try to get them to the level of good enough. I often talk to teachers and I talk about the sausage machine that is in education. I watch the bristles on their necks stand up as I say it. And I don't mean to be offensive in that, but it is not possible to develop an educational offering for every child that is bespoke and perfect for them. They actually need to have a standard approach in the way they administer a curriculum. We can't do it any other way, not unless we want to spend more money than we could ever afford in developing an educational system. So it is a bit of a sausage machine, and if you aren't straight down the line, predictable and normal in the way, neurotypical in the way you are formed, then you will have a challenge. And part of our job as clinicians is to help non-neurotypical kids make their way positively through the sausage machine that is education. One of the lovely things is that if they get through the education system without being completely destroyed by it, they will find a niche, or they can find a niche, and they can do wonderful things. They can sit out the back, not have to deal with more than 3 people, and be really interested in data analysis, and they'll be fine, but you've got to get them there. I talk to families about, I'm running out of time, so I'm sorry I'm talking so long. I talk to families about a barbecue test. And it's every time I see a child, I think of the barbecue test. And the barbecue test is this future child when she is 25. And the barbecue test is different for men and women. But it is, at age 25, going to a barbecue and making it through that experience. Now, as a male, the barbecue test consists of, first of all, being social enough to be able to get a partner, being social enough to be invited to a barbecue, making it to the barbecue and sitting there and talking about things that are deeply uninteresting to you. And so, for me, although I'm wearing a Western Bulldogs top, I actually hate football. I find watching the grass growing more interesting than football. And yet, I am a male and I live in Victoria, and I'm a father of boys and a girl, all of whom play AFL. So I go to 3 matches a week. And if I go to a barbecue, there is a fair bet at age 25 that the topic of football is going to come up. And one of the skills, if I have autism, I need to learn is to talk about things that don't interest me very much. And I need to be able to just get along. So I, as an official follower of the Western Bulldogs, know that we won the grand final last year. I'm vaguely aware that our captain didn't play, but is a really seriously good bloke. I know that we've won probably a little over half our games this year, and that's pretty much all I know about the Western Bulldogs. But it's enough for me to get by. I know that everyone hates Collingwood. So I know enough to get by. So I can hold my own in a conversation about football, so long as they don't start talking about which coaches needs to be kicked out and stuff like that. So that's part of it. Now, that's part of the barbecue test. The next part of the barbecue test is, if I have autism, I'm going to have a lifelong tendency towards anxiety, particularly when I have to go and meet people I don't know. Now, I go to a barbecue, there's a lot of them. One of the things I need to learn to do is to manage that anxiety and deal with that anxiety without getting completely drunk. Because it's a short-term anxiolytic, but it is a real risk for these people. And so anticipating this and working hard on dealing with anxiety and tips and tricks and strategies from a very early age so that you can deal with anxiety without resorting to extraordinary amounts of alcohol. That's the next part of the barbecue test. Next thing as a male is being able to kick a football straight enough so that I don't seem silly, and being able to at least hit a cricket ball sometimes, and there I've passed. Oh, and also cook the meat without burning it. That's it. That's all I have to do. It's really easy. Yeah. As a female, it's different. And I'm not a female. I've never been a female. I don't really understand females. But as a female, the barbecue test is different. The barbecue test is about subtle interaction. It is about female-to-female communication, which is complex and nuanced and all that sort of stuff. And I don't understand it. But I know it's important. Yep. Part of the barbecue test for a female person with autism is to just be able to get by, to be able to do enough of it, to know your social graces, to know the stuff you need to know, to be able to communicate in that, and I don't know, prepare the salads and whatever else I do. Barbecue test.
Not burn the meat.
Yes, not burn the meat. Well, yes. Anyway, that's a whole nother talk. But every time I see a child, I'm thinking about the 25-year-old adult. And what do we need to do to get this child to pass the barbecue test? And when I see gains, I celebrate the gains, but I kind of in my head I draw a line. And is that gain enough? Is it going to get us there? Because if it's not, I still need to do more, even though there's been a gain. Okay. Common associations are anxiety, unsurprising. If you take as a given that a person has autism spectrum disorder, 30% will have genuine, reliably diagnosed ADHD. Iron deficiency, because they eat terribly, is important. Vitamin deficiencies are quite common as well. Many of them don't like going outside and really, really, really like computers, and so vitamin D will often be low. And we had a kid today with a severe vitamin A deficiency, and I have to say that's the first time I've seen that. Diagnosed because the kid had no night vision. There you go. Poor dentition. The anxiety means that it's difficult to sit in a dentist chair. And that's another thing we're trying to do as a hospital. We're just dipping our toes in the water. I wish we could offer it to everyone, but we can't. But we're moving towards having routine elective general anaesthetic lists for dental work for people who otherwise would just never get near a dentist. Now, we can't open that to everyone, but we're dipping our toes in because we know that they need it long term. And they often end up quite overweight because they don't do very much. Referral pathways, well, there's lots. There's, a lot of these organisations will do aspects of diagnosis and aspects of treatment and support. So the Bears Clinic has been established, and even when I was living and working in Shepparton, I would send lots of kids across to Bendigo to attend the Bears Clinic, which is the Bendigo Early Assessment and Referral Service, or something like that, which is very good and important, and costs money. So Community Health have an impressive and laudable commitment to people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, but they can't run this for free. So they'll do payment plans and all sorts of things to help families that struggle, but it still costs money. The Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service used to see 2 patients a month, and they, funnily enough, thought they were doing all of the assessments, but they've realised that they don't, and they've really stepped up, and they're making a bigger effort to work with other organisations, and so they're freer and more able to take referrals and do assessments in a way for families that couldn't afford to go anywhere else. They'll really love it if you can organise some assessments before. So if they can have a pragmatic speech assessment before, that will really help, and possibly some other things. Everything you can give them will make it quicker for them to assess the patient. And then there are private options. So there's plenty of paediatricians. Well, there are not plenty. There are more paediatricians than there used to be, but I still think we need more. And there are at least three different private providers of occupational therapy that I know of. I know of at least 2 speech groups that are working, and you'd know that there are 4 or 5 different nodes of psychology now in Bendigo, and access is better than it's ever been. It's not great, but it's better than it's ever been. And if you wanted to send people out of Bendigo for assessment, there is the Autism Spectrum Disorders Clinic in Kew, which I use from time to time, but I have to name it. Every patient I've ever sent there, bar none, has come back with a diagnosis. I think I joke, and it's disrespectful to joke about professional colleagues, I joke that everybody who walks past probably gets a diagnosis. But it is Kew, so that's actually possibly correct. Anyway, any questions about autism? Yeah?
What happens with the transition from paediatrician into you get too old and,
Okay, so the question is, what do we do at transition? Paediatricians do transition terribly, badly. We need to do better. One of our problems is that we have trouble letting go. But when I'm transitioning a person with autism spectrum disorder, I think of 2 aspects. For the adult, it's mostly around psychology, and it's mostly around health. And I would transfer to an interested GP, and I would be talking about that 2 years before I did the transfer. And it shouldn't be a transfer, it should have been co-management all along, and I acknowledge that we don't do that very well either. But the other part of it is psychology. And I'd love some psychologists to take a deeper interest in this, because I think there's a niche which is underfilled. I think it is a specialist area to know the personality and to reflect back to these people their personality and coach them in having a more fulfilling life. And so sometimes I send them down to psychologists in Melbourne, because I'm not sure, I haven't seen anybody who holds deep skills in that, respectfully.
I have a patient who's in her 60s that has struggled with it for many years.
Yeah,
And she had gone to a few psychologists.
yeah,
She got onto a psychiatrist here in Bendigo, but she just came back and saw me and she said, they get me. She said it was
for the first time.
ever. She said, I say something and they're like, yes. And yeah, she said she's a totally different person now. Before
Yeah.
she was very socially isolated and knew her diagnosis, but for years couldn't manage it very well, and then got onto a great psychiatrist here in town, and
Yeah.
she's a different person.
Would you be willing to name that psychiatrist?
Dr. Teslin Matthews.
Okay, there you go. I think that experience of having autism reflected back to adults is very important, because if you've never had the label and you've wandered through life not understanding why you have the challenges you have, why it is hard for you to make and hold friends, why you are so socially isolated, why you get in trouble with your boss quite often because for whatever reason, and why you are struggling in your relationship, to actually look at yourself and reflect with somebody who knows this stuff very well, I think is very therapeutic. And I didn't know Dr. Matthews was interested, but that's
yeah,
good.
Well,
Yeah.
I know it takes different, you find your person,
Yeah.
that's happens to
Work
be
for her.
person,
Yeah.
but you just get it.
Yeah. Another question after that.
What do you think about the anti-anxiety fluoxetine for this age of 14, 15 and 16?
Okay, so I think lots of things. I think that anxiety disorder is a real problem, and I think there is a role for fluoxetine in these patients. That's one thing I think. I think we need to be careful. I think more than other aspects of our pharmacotherapy approach, the psych drugs have been corrupted a little bit. I think that they've been oversold. I think that there is published evidence for the use in adolescents, certainly major depression and probably anxiety. But we often find ourselves as doctors who have the ability to prescribe being forced to do something. Yep. And so we find ourselves stretching more and more further out to things which really the research doesn't cover. I think we need to be mindful of that. I think we need to be, I don't think we should be purists, but I think when we're going further than the evidence goes, we should be careful in what we're doing, and we should be monitoring them, because what if the side effects are worse than the positive effects, and are we sure there are positive effects, and so on. That would be my own clinical experience, which is that low doses work as well as higher doses. And so the pharmacists often laugh because I use a quarter of a 20 milligram tablet. Particularly if I'm using it in prepubescent kids. I don't go past that very often. I don't often use it in prepubescent kids, but I do sometimes. And with adolescents, often half a tablet's enough. And if you're dealing with anxiety, which is not touching the sides with those, you can try going up, but your side effects are going to increase and the benefits aren't going to increase that much. But I'm just a humble paediatrician. A psychiatrist might have a different view, but that's my clinical experience. The other thing I think, in 2017, I'm not aware of any evidence for any other antidepressant having good effect. And so the only one I really use now is fluoxetine, because it's got the evidence that the others don't have.
Just a question, Andy. The Base Clinic, Noah's Ark, are they available for only, do they have a set age bracket that the access is there, or can they be available for more than 5, 6 plus kids?
So Noah's Ark are a service provider and not an assessor. So they will give whoever they get. Now, they're going to open, I guess, they're going to open themselves up to a lot of people because whoever NDIS will fund.
Right.
But up until now, they have done mostly early intervention, and that stops at school entry, whether that's age 5 or 6 or whatever. But that will probably change. The Bears Clinic, who wants to comment from Bendigo Community Health?
There's no lower limit.
Yeah.
So they can, as young as you're concerned, you can refer them to Bendigo Community Health. And up to, usually not above 12, 13, I don't remember the official
Now,
cutoff.
I think that reflects, up until now, what the funding has allowed for. So there has been a stream of funding through a couple of mechanisms within government to support people with autism up until that age, and I think that's why that age cut off, because beyond that, there wasn't a lot of value. And it cost families money. But that's going to all change with NDIS. So one day, it might be that community health changes those age criteria.
I generally struggle with when we refer to the paediatric personnel, no matter if it's Central Victorian Child Health or elsewhere.
Yeah.
And this is for a 5+old child who's probably on the lower end of the spectrum, but now start developing more symptoms, suggesting that parents in school can pick up the anxiety side of things.
Yeah.
And then they come back asking for yes, it's there, but we can't access we don't have the money to actually access private psychology, private speech, private OT kind of thing. So is there more of a multidisciplinary approach on the horizon through the public system at some point of time? So there are a couple of ways to subsidise it, but there are not many ways to completely fund it. So it can be subsidised, first of all, you can access paediatricians at a lower rate of Bendigo Community Health. There is a wait, and it might be a registrar, but you can access paediatric services. If that paediatrician bills, our item numbers are much smaller than GP item numbers. So 110, which is the lower of the two new item numbers we use, then it is possible for that paediatrician to refer for a number of allied health visits specifically for the purposes of assessment for autism. Now, that doesn't pay $176, but it might pay $80 or $100 off it. I can't remember exactly that amount. Sometimes we'll ask a GP to make a referral under a chronic illness care plan, because for some reason we can't do that because the Medicare requirements are complex. So sometimes you'll get either that phone call or that letter from us asking for that, which will subsidise but not completely pay for it. And that thing can be used even for those kids that you say that you don't have autism spectrum disorder yet. Because they have some problems, but they haven't got a formal diagnosis.
No, if they don't have diagnosis, there's no money.
Okay.
Yep, there's no money without a diagnosis.
They haven't got diagnosis.
Again, that might change with NDIS, but I'm not sure how far it will change, because not everybody will be allowed to have unlimited speech forever, because the finances won't allow it. So at some stage they're going to tighten up again. But the whole point of NDIS, as I understand it, is it's less about labels and more about how is the disability affecting you and what can we do to help you. And so there will be an aspect of label to it, but it's more about the function. And so hopefully one day kids like that will get something, but I'm not sure exactly how far that will go.
And I've heard an interesting diagnosis of, from the pediatric personnel about emotional dysregulation and sensory, processing disorder.
Okay.
Is that something which overlaps in the spectrum, so it's an entirely different kettle of fish?
It sits with it's a diagnosis of the damned.
Because I've got a letter saying that it doesn't fit into autism spectrum disorder, but this is the diagnosis, and you can access APCs for that.
Yeah. So there is, they are valid disorders with definitions behind them, but they are disorders that if you do not have substantial resources to go privately, they will not get you very far, unfortunately.
So Andy, you're classifying autism as a disease, not a disability.
No, hang on.
I'm just putting it out there, you're saying send them to the GP.
Yeah, so I need to be mindful that I have to talk about heads, because some people have come to talk about heads, so I'm going to talk for a minute about that. What's the job of a doctor? One of our jobs is to make diagnoses, whether you call them diseases, disorders or whatever, but some diseases and disorders carry disabilities along with them. So if you transect the spinal cord, the diagnosis is the transection of the spinal cord, the disability that comes with it is an inability to move your lower legs and keep your anus closed at the right time. So that's the disability. So with autism in the same way, I actually think that's a description of a disorder, maybe not a disease, but a disorder. Disease, maybe it is, but it carries a disability with it. Is that fair as a differentiation? Agree to split the difference?
Just wondering about Medicare's looking at that differential.
Hang on, say that again, sorry.
I'm just wondering how Medicare will look at this definition.
Yeah.
With ABCs and management plans and all of that stuff.
Yeah, It's a policy question beyond my pay grade, but I stand ready and interested to look at as well.